Okay, everyone, thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to another workshop of how to do research and get published. Today, we're focusing on what it takes to get published in academic journals, specifically focusing on creating a research agenda and developing your personal academic brand. So to get started, I'd like to introduce the team you'll be hearing from today. So first, we'll be with Janet Salmons, PhD, who is a methodologist, an academic writer, and artist. She is the research community manager for Sage's publishing research community called MethodSpace. Her areas of interest include emerging research methods and teaching and collaborative learning in the digital age. Her recent books include Doing Qualitative Research Online, What Kind of a Researcher Are You?, and Reframing and Rethinking Collaboration in Higher Education and Beyond, just to name a few. She lives and works in Boulder, Colorado. Next, Dr. Mark Carrigan is a lecturer in education at the University of Manchester, where he is program director for the MA Digital Technologies, Communication and Education, or DCTE, and co-lead of the DCTE Research and Scholarship Group. He's the author of Social Media for Academics, published by Sage, and which is now in its second edition. He's currently writing Generative AI for Academics, which will be released next year. We're also joined by Jessica Isowa, a professor in the Joseph R. Biden Jr. School of Public Policy Administration at the University of Delaware. Her research focuses on public and nonprofit management, with an emphasis on organizational effectiveness, leadership, and the management of human resources in public and nonprofit organizations. She has co-edited numerous books and has published numerous journal articles. She serves on the editorial board of a number of journals in public administration and has served as the editor-in-chief of the Review of Public Personnel Administration from 2018 till 2023. She is also currently the co-editor-in-chief of Perspectives on Public Management and Governance. And last, I am Sean Scarsberg, a marketing manager on the author marketing team at Sage. My primary role is to provide support to authors and reviewers as they move through the publishing process, with a particular focus on providing targeted resources to provide support at the appropriate time in the publication process. I have a BA in history from Manhattan College and an MA in history from Hunter College, and I am based out of New York. So here, this chart illustrates a timeline of the typical author journey, moving from the early stages of securing funding, conducting research, all the way through peer review and publication. Today, we're focusing on developing your research agenda and your personal brand, which sits at the beginning of the timeline. So we encourage you to go back and watch recordings of other topics that we've covered in the series, including how to write and format a manuscript and how to navigate the peer review process. So here's an agenda of what we'll be talking about today. Today, we'll have a panel discussion and we'll end with a Q&A. So as part of that, please do send us your questions. So you'll see at the bottom of your screen the Q&A feature. Please feel free to pop in any questions that come up that you have for our panelists that they'll be able to respond to at the end of the call. We recognize that we may not be able to get to all of them during the live call, so we will respond to those that we need to via email after the fact. But as you're looking at the Q&A, if you see any in particular that you do like, please like them or upvote them. I'll filter through at the end of the call to ensure that those that have the most upvotes and likes will be responded to first. So with that, I will pass it over to Janet to get it, to Janet to get us started.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Making your name as a credible researcher and finding a position or a place where you can carry out your research agenda is complicated today. Not that it's ever been easy, but approaches from the past, such as presenting and networking at conferences in your specific field, have been disrupted by a number of developments in academia and, of course, by the COVID pandemic. While things like face-to-face conferences still occur, our day-to-day connections and communities are more typically online. And we see dramatic changes there too, with social media going through upheavals that are not necessarily conducive to our kind of scholarly engagement and networking. Also, today, building an academic career is not always tied to one discipline or perhaps even to one institution, with more openness to intersectional, interdisciplinary, and even independent scholarship. So how, in this complicated and dynamic environment, do we find our paths and find the way to move forward? those are some of the topics we're going to discuss today, with two interrelated questions. First, about finding one's identity as a researcher, and then finding and communicating your place in the world so that you can build credibility and your reputation for the expertise that you have to share. So our first question is, how does affiliation with one or more disciplines relate to your identity as a researcher or a scholar, and what advice do you have for our attendees here today? And so, Jessica, why don't you start?
Great. Thank you, Janet. So to give you guys a little bit of context, very briefly on what I do, my PhD is in public administration, which public administration is really the study of the business of public service, so including both government and nonprofit organizations. And I actually nest across both of those. I always joke that I'm bisectoral. I do both government and nonprofits. So thinking about how to cultivate those two different audiences and think about how my work communicates across both of those has been something I've been thinking about my whole career, and how you balance that. Thinking about charting your academic journey, it really always starts with the kind of fundamental question that drives your research. Going back to your why and remembering the why that brought you to this work, and thinking about how you articulate that why. So in my field, what's really fun is that there's a lot of different things I can study, and I have to be careful sometimes because, you can get involved in curiosity-driven research and you want your work to kind of coalesce as a whole. So what I have is a sort of broad overarching question that drives my research, which is, how do we make sure that the organizations and the individuals within those organizations that are providing public service work to the best of their ability to produce public value for citizens? So within that, I can then have multiple streams of research. So having sort of a coherent, clear, pithy why is a great place to start. That kind of 1 or 2 sentence elevator speech that when you meet someone at a conference, or you're, in your social media bio or things like that, that kind of get across what you're doing and communicate your purpose. And that purpose also acts as sort of your North Star, or your driving screen on the projects you take and the choices you make, thinking about how does that continue to refresh and reinvigorate my identity. But again, as many of us sit across multiple disciplines, in public administration, I can go to conferences in political science, the Academy of Management, nonprofit conferences, other public administration conferences. I want to be thinking about, if I go in different directions, how do I still think about the fidelity of my journey at a period of time? So I'm going to say one more thing, and then I want to pass it off because I want this to be a dialogue versus me talking. At least in the United States, I recognize we have a very international audience. One of the things you want to think about as you build your academic brand and your research agenda is, what are the structures and institutional requirements to be successful in your particular position? So I have been doing this officially 20 years this year, which is amazing. It feels like I got my PhD yesterday. And I'm a full professor, so I've gone through all the different stages of promotion. And since I received tenure and promotion here in the United States, I've written probably about 50 external review letters for scholars across the world for different tenure and promotion. So I see a lot of different packages and how people put that together. So one of the things you do need to understand is, what is required to be successful in your field? And then within that, what are the degrees of freedom you have to make choices, to build an identity that makes you happy and allows you to do fulfilling, exciting research that, will keep your interest sparked. So you got to think about, what do you need to do to keep your job? Then also within that, what is the freedom you have to carve your own voice, and the agency you have to do that is something I'd love to talk about throughout today, because some of those choices you make within those structures allows you to have some freedom to really be you and be successful being you. So I will pass it to Mark so we can dialogue.
Yeah, thank you. That really resonates with me. I come to this as someone who's had a fairly nomadic intellectual journey. I originally trained as a philosopher, then at the point where I was signed up to a political philosophy PhD, which I would not have been able to get through I don't know why I signed up to it. It just seemed like the logical next step at that point. I stepped back at the last minute and retrained as a social researcher, did a PhD part-time and a postdoc in sociology, worked outside of the academy, albeit not very far outside of the academy, as a digital comms practitioner and strategist for some time, and then went back into academia through education. And the reason why I immediately felt at home in education was because that linking of theory and practice was well suited to education. In sociology, I'd found that colleagues were skeptical at best, sneering at worst about my interest in practice. And it was seen as a distraction, whereas in education, everyone immediately got why I was interested in the practical application of the work I was doing. And I learned as much from that as I did from more abstract research. But the problem with that kind of journey is that it's hard to sustain your identity. And I really resonated, Jessica, with what you were saying about having to understand what you need to thrive professionally at each point and what really motivates you. And partly because my core interest is in motivation. I'm interested in, you know, how we form projects and act on them and the way in which technology shapes and that in helpful and problematic ways. That's something I spend a lot of time thinking about, because for each of those academic milieus, there's a different set of norms, there's a different set of references, there's a different way of talking. And I've been in education for 5-6 years now, and it's only now that I feel I can able to really pass myself off as an education person in some settings. For a long time, I was, without realizing it, speaking as a sociologist in a way that, because there were other sociologists in education, I could connect with them. And yet I often found that many educationalists didn't understand where I was coming from. And, you know, I realized I was only speaking to a subset of them. And there's something almost ethnographic, I think, about that kind of experience. As you move through different intellectual worlds, professional worlds, you learn to present yourself in different ways. You get a feel for what's expected in the game. Some things work, some things don't. And one of the reasons why I find social media so fascinating is it's a site where that exploration can happen. It can be challenging because as you move through different professional communities, you know, you encounter lots of interactions that are challenging or, you know, not familiar to you. But if you have a reflexive approach to social media, it can be a site where we learn how to do that. In the same way that, you know, going to an unfamiliar conference can be a great way of learning about the norms in a new area. But it's expensive and it can be very anxiety provoking, at least if you're an introvert. Whereas social media is an easier way of doing that. But we often fall into using social media in a slightly mindless way. We do it out of habit and routine, you know, when we're tired or trying to kill time. And I would advocate using social media as a way of exploring these professional worlds to learn the lingo, observe the norms, get a sense of what people are talking about. And if you do that, it can really enrich your capacity to present yourself in effective ways. And it can help bridge that gap. So what matters to you, the curiosity that motivates you, the things that you find yourself preoccupied by and you keep coming back to, you know, that's what keeps us going in research. But if we also learn how to translate that into these different forms of lingo, that could be really helpful. And a kind of alienation that I think many of us feel within higher education, it can't be overcome through social media, but I think it can be soothed if we use it in this careful way.
Can I jump in on that? I was really struck by a couple of things you said. So when I study nonprofits, when we talk about like nonprofits using social media, in particular, one of the things we talk about is developing a listening strategy, you know, thinking about what are people talking about. And when I do journal editor panels, I always tell people, picture your research like a dinner party that you're going to. You don't walk into a dinner party and go, what everyone's talking about is dumb and I would like to change the conversation. You listen, you dialogue, you know, maybe you steer gently in different directions, but it's more of a flow. So thinking about, you know, especially as we work across different spaces, when we step into different spaces, reading, listening, seeing what people are talking about, and then thinking about how do we organically join that conversation can be a really great way to, you know, connect across fields. So I absolutely love that. I think sometimes in research, we're trained to sort of look for the gap or we're trained in a sort of negative way of thinking about versus thinking about how do we contribute to the conversation? How do we keep things going? How do we say that's really interesting, but have you thought about this? Not like you're clearly wrong or you clearly have missed something. So yeah, and I think social media has, I've connected with a lot of scholars across Twitter that I might not have ever met. And it's a little strange when people come up to me at a conference and they're like, I follow you on Twitter. And I'm like, oh, okay. Hope you like my dog pictures. But so it's interesting that, I think it allows for some of also the flattening of some of the hierarchies that exist, because you're able to show people in some ways your whole self. They might still be excited to meet scholar you, but they also, have seen your puppy or the thing you've baked or things like that.
Yeah, and if you approach social media in that way, it automatically solves one of the problems people have, well, academics in particular have, which is, what do I tweet about? What do I blog about? You tweet and blog about what matters to you, what you're thinking about, what you've read, what you're struggling with, what you're working on. And, when it works, and, there are real and growing problems with social media as it is currently constituted, which I guess we can get onto later. But when it does work, it brings people together, because the best connections, the ones that are really valuable, the ones that stay with you, are ones that are grounded in a shared sense of interest. You're moved by the same questions, you're working in, if not on the same topics, at least in similar directions. And the kind of academic friendships that have stayed with me have been ones often through social media. And they could have easily been transitory connections, but those connections, how they form, you can find that similarity. You can find the fact you're both going in the same direction. And it could be an effective way of staying in communication with them, because it is so easy to slot it into, around constraints of geography, around constraints of work, around constraints of family. And I often find that those academic friendships through social media are ones that I can come back to effortlessly after a long period of time. During the pandemic, I kind of withdrew into a bubble in many ways, as quite a lot of people did. And the people I was most enjoyed reconnecting with were those people. And that capacity to keep coming back to people, to come back to topics, to come back to potential projects. I've often found that with some of these people, there are things we've been talking about doing for 10 years, and then eventually we do get around to doing them. And there's those things that we haven't got around to doing, but I'm hoping in the next 10 years or 20 years, we'll get around to doing. The projects that really mean a lot, in my experience, come through those sorts of connections. They're not the ones that you do because you think it's going to immediately advantage your career or because it's going to bring you acclaim and prestige. They're ones you come to because you've been talking about them for a long time, and you talk about them for a long time because they matter to you. They move you in some way.
I think
there are a couple of points I want to just, really reinforce that came out of both of your conversations. I think both of you talked a little bit about kind of balancing the external requirements and expectations with your own, looking for the place where you can have the freedom and flexibility to pursue the things that really drive you and that may make you unique and, ultimately, give you a more distinctive, place in the world. And I should point out that Mark and I are just, walking the talk of what he just said, because I was a loyal reader of his early blog on digital sociology, even though that was really not my field, but it was interesting to me. And so I think, some of the points about, feeling confident enough to share, some of those interests that might be outside of, say, the specific realm of your scholarly work can sometimes, help to build the networks that will, really help you to thrive. The other point that really struck me, Mark, when you were talking about, kind of thinking you were going to go one path and then going another path, and having the courage to just say, this just doesn't fit for me, and I need to, even though it may be scary, to kind of step off the ledge and try something else that, that really is important as we're, trying to, especially if as the viewers for this webinar, if you're at the beginning of your career path, you might feel more pressure to, kind of stay in some expected realm, but, really take a wider look at that. Anything else that you would like to add before we go to our second question?
I just want to reiterate what you said on that. I mean, this is a marathon, and our life, we want to sort of think about, what do we want to do? To quote Mary Oliver, what do we want to do with our one precious life? Academia requires a lot of, and research requires a lot of, thinking, work. We're learning in public. We're being vulnerable, and so if you are not fundamentally excited by what you're doing, it's going to be a little rough. So I think thinking about, the agency you have to craft a research or a broadly constructed academic journey that makes you happy is, I think, the most important thing. And it's hard because we all have mentors and people that we care about and want to make happy. But at the end of the day, we're the ones who are living this life. So thinking about, what do I envision my career to be? And how do I make choices that have fidelity for my personal journey and also where I want to get, I think is just really critical.
Yeah, definitely. And you captured perfectly, Janet, the anxiety that can be involved in making that decision at an early stage. At the time when I was an MA student, dreading this political philosophy PhD that I'd signed up to, the person who then became my PhD supervisor was the one I talked to. She just happened to teach me. She had no real obligation to spend an hour talking it through with me, but she did. And, it was life-changing. I mean, she sadly died earlier on this year, and I thought a lot about that early intervention. And, I worked with her as a PhD student part-time and a postdoc for 10 years. And, she was a close friend as well as a mentor. And the confidence she gave me to make that decision was genuinely life-changing, because I think I would have dropped out of that philosophy PhD. And, now I'm at a different stage in my career and I'm starting to become more established. It makes me think about the importance of making time to talk things through with people, and how just listening and giving the benefit of what experience you have accumulated. It often doesn't take much effort to do that, but it can sometimes have a real impact on people. And that kind of generosity, I think, is something that we need to make time for, even if it's difficult when, teaching is intense and there's lots of administration and so forth, which I am feeling at the moment.
Can I amplify that? And especially, I think, as advice for the attendees, as we build relationships, try to do it as much as possible, thinking about investing in those relationships, not making it transactional, and thinking about how we are all in this together. I always like to say to people, I try to lift as I climb. I had 4 of the 5 members of my dissertation committee were women, and they were amazing female mentors. So I've, in particular, spent a lot of time talking to early career researchers who are women or female identifying, and thinking about how to overcome some of those hurdles. But I always say there's no occupancy limit on the VIP room in our club. Like, we can all be successful in different ways. So the more we can do that, and Janet, back to one of your earlier points about the pandemic, because I am a more senior researcher, I actually several times during the pandemic set up Zooms for early career scholars, PhD students, and we kind of got together in a safe space and, talked about things. And a lot of times, when people come up to me at conferences and they want to talk to me, when you're at the reception, you're kind of tired, you just want cheese at that point and a glass of wine. But I really try as much as I can to be like, send me an email, let's set up a Zoom, let's chat, because I think there's a lot of hidden curriculum in academia that we've all learned at different stages. And the more that we can make that transparent for the generations coming up behind us, the more we all succeed. Because, we are so blessed to be in the business of learning.
And I love what you're saying about, giving back. And so for those who are watching, even if you're at an early stage and you're thinking like, well, I don't really know anything, how can I mentor someone else? Well, there probably is something that you have to give, and thinking about that, sense of community means both, giving and receiving. And as we become more experienced, making the time to mentor, coach, and encourage others is really important, because it is a challenging kind of work. So I want to just, move on, and some of the points that we're making, we can build on as we're thinking about, well, how do we, you've mentioned a little bit about social media, blogging, and some of these informal channels. We, kind of traditionally, researchers have relied on publications and presentations within their fields, and, broader communications through online channels like the place we're in now, and, other kinds of online communities give us another, way of building, those communities and relationships. So, for the people who are viewing this recording and attending here today, what suggestions do you have for, people who are, trying to, make their expertise known, make their, communicate who they are within their, the different channels that are available? How might those informal modes complement or reinforce some of the more formal channels like journal publications?
Yeah, I think it's important to say at the outset, this is more difficult than it used to be, which is a serious problem, particularly after the pandemic, when face-to-face events, at least in my university system, and I perceive more widely, are not returning in the way they once did. And there are lots of advantages to that in terms of sustainability, in terms of accessibility. But I worry a lot about newer researchers in this environment because of the difficulty of cementing connections face-to-face. I think doing things online has a virtue. The size and breadth of the audience today is an example of exactly why online events can be so valuable. But it's very difficult to cement real substantial connections entirely online. Connections can form online, then move offline and back online. And when there is that kind of give and take between the two media, that's when they can be most powerful. And so that's why I think it would be more important than ever to have social media be accessible as a way of getting known and finding intellectual communities, because there are less opportunities to do that face-to-face, including less funding in many systems. The problem are the changes currently underway within social media. There's a risk of focusing too much on Elon Musk as an individual character and explaining the problems with Twitter. Clearly he's responsible for some of it. But at the same time, I think this is the life cycle of social media. We're seeing social media platforms to varying extents become what they were always going to become, because they're at a different stage in their economic evolution now. And as platforms move towards subscription-based models, it's going to become more unequal, particularly as they incentivize subscriptions by promising extra visibility to those who will pay. And the capacity of these spaces to level hierarchies is diminishing. I think it was always a bit overstated, but it's diminishing. And the other problem is that audiences are fragmenting across platforms, whereas Twitter had become if not the go-to place for academics, a significant go-to place. Now you'll find academics in varying configurations across Blue Sky, LinkedIn, Threads, Mastodon. And this is a real problem because it's not possible to sustain a meaningful presence across all of these platforms at the same time. Given the other things that you've got to spend your time doing, you probably do have to pick. I've largely given up on Twitter X at this point and spend my time on Blue Sky and LinkedIn. Blue Sky, because it's a more sociological, more academic community. Friends of mine use Blue Sky, so it's a way of keeping in touch with them. LinkedIn, it's commonly used at my university, so there's an element of internal networking there. And particularly for digital education, and practitioner communities are very visible on LinkedIn. So I have two different platforms which I use for two different reasons. I've got a disclaimer on my Blue Sky account saying this is a semi-private account. If you want me to talk about digital education, please go to LinkedIn. So I do sometimes talk about work on there, but mostly I save that for LinkedIn. And if you look through my LinkedIn account, I would be fairly certain there's not a single post in years that has anything that isn't directly to do with my work. And so that's a compromise that works for me, where I found those two platforms and I found different audiences on each of them. And I found elements of the platforms that speak to me in different ways. The informality and humor of Blue Sky reminds me of Twitter in the golden age of Twitter in the early 2010s. And the formality of LinkedIn and the audiences there are really effective for networking, which is not to say I approach it in a purely transactional way. You know, I share thoughts, I share ideas in process, but I do it in a professional way. And the challenge at the moment is that everyone is going to have to find where their audience is. And that's not quite as difficult as I might make it sound if you've not done this yet. Because you know part of who your audience is because you're already connected with them. You know, find out the people that you work with, you collaborate with, you meet at conferences. Find out where people you like are spending their time online and consider whether that's where you should spend your time online. And there's going to be an element of trial and experimentation in that. So get a feel for it, sign up, find people you already know if you haven't already, you know, literally search for names, try and connect with them, try and talk to them, play with the platform, see if it works for you or if it feels wrong in some way. See how other people are using it. If you see someone whose use you like, try and articulate why you like it. Even better, if you see someone whose use of the platform you find frustrating, then I would try and articulate that, because getting a sense of what you believe is proper comportment, what's an academic way to behave online, that often requires putting into words intuitions and gut reactions. And when you put them into words, it can be much easier to understand how you want to behave online. And so you need to find out where the audiences you're already connected with are, and that's easy because you can ask them to varying degrees. But you also need to think about the audiences you want to connect with, and that can be more difficult. Who are the groups who it would enrich your work professionally, intellectually, even instrumentally to be connected to? And what can you find out about where they are? And so you need to do this kind of modeling now in a way which I just think wasn't the case. And calling it modeling makes it sound much more complex than it is. But you're going to have to do some research to answer these questions effectively. But if you do that research, you're then able to find, with a bit of experimentation, a kind of practical mode of doing this that works for you. It will involve some degree of compromise. It won't feel perfect. You need to factor in how much time and energy you really have available for this, but that's possible. And as you're doing this, you need to promote your presence as it currently exists. This can be in existing networks as well. So add your social media handles to your email signature, add it to slides, add it to a Zoom name. I mean, I'm realizing that I've not done this, but it's something that can be quite effective. And you also need a website. And I think to be seen and heard in this environment, the website is really key. The advantage of institutional websites is that university websites tend to have very good search engine rankings. And so if someone searches for your name, you're likely to return relatively high up, unless your name is shared by a lot of people. The downside is that in an increasingly precarious higher education, many of us will not be with one employer forever, to say the least. And this means that your identity is tied to the employer. But it can be a good start as a bare minimum. And you can also create your own website using something like WordPress, Wix, Squarespace. These are free to use in their basic forms. And you can very quickly and easily get a website online that says who you are, what you do, what you have done, and crucially, how people can contact you. And I think that level of visibility is really important, particularly the social media landscape becomes more fragmented and volatile, because that just means that you're discoverable. And you want to be discoverable in order to enhance the connections you're having offline. If people see you talk at a conference, if you meet someone at a workshop, just colleagues at work or people elsewhere in your university you might encounter in a meeting. You want to make it possible for people to find you so that the people who you have a potential connection with are likely to act on it. And at the same time, you should find other people. If you're familiar with social media, there can be a reticence about following people online. But anyone who has a professional social media profile wants to be followed. You know, the very fact you put up a professional account means that you encourage people to interact with you and to follow you. So you should feel free to reach out while also respecting the norms of different platforms. You know, so Facebook classic product is probably not appropriate to connect with someone from a workplace setting on there unless you have evidence to the contrary. But I think, and some people disagree with me about this, but I think you should feel free to connect with someone whose work you find interesting on LinkedIn. Possibly just make sure that you include a brief statement of where you came across them. You know, I read your book and really enjoyed it. I'd love to keep up to date with your work, something like that. And so I'll be quiet now because I'm worried that I'm rambling slightly. But what I wanted to get across is that there is a degree of experimentation and research involved in this now, and that is increasing because of these structural changes in social media. But each step of this process is not complicated. You just have to make sure that you think about it. And don't assume that everyone else knows what they're doing because they're already doing it. We're all often mystified by this. And the best way to counteract that is to talk to people you do know face to face, talk to colleagues about this. One thing that I've tried to set up in multiple institutions I've worked in or communities of practice to actually have forums, even completely informal, where you talk about these issues are really valuable. Because still, even now, this is not front and center in professional training in the way that I think it should be. It tends to be relegated to a single session at best about using social media in general. But using social media for building a research community, finding your research community, is challenging, and it touches all aspects of the work that we do.
Jessica, do you have something you'd like to add? And then we'll take some of our questions from the attendees.
Sure. I think one of the things that I think are sort of cardinal rule across all our interactions is just try to be authentic, try to be respectful, try to, think about the social capital that we all share together. And there's a lot of sort of organizational citizenship behavior that's required for academia to succeed. Every time we send out a manuscript for peer review, we owe the universe, 3 reviews somewhere to kind of keep that circle of life going. Sometimes some of the strategies I've seen, there's a early career scholar at a university in Europe. He has this very adorable beagle, and he does like Wilma's reviews of different manuscripts. So he'll read an article and like tweet about it, or X about it, or whatever we're calling that now, and tag the journal and or tag the authors. And it's really lovely and thoughtful. It's sort of like, here's what I'm reading, and here's why Wilma, my beagle, is excited about it. And the journals are usually excited. They'll retweet that. Authors are, what do we want? We want people to read our work. When people read our work, it's the coolest thing ever. It's still never not exciting for somebody to be like, I read your article and I loved it. And I know I try to do that sometimes myself. A friend of mine had done something called like Scholar Sunday, where he would, tweet about different scholars. And sometimes I'll think about who I think is a really interesting early career scholar that's doing cool work. And I'll sort of tweet about them and be like, don't sleep on this person, or I have an intellectual crush on them, or things like that, to kind of think about how we can amplify. So sometimes, just stuff you're reading and excited about, posting something, saying like, and tagging. I don't think any of us, the day that ever gets old for any of us is when we probably should get over ourselves, because it's always wonderful. And so I think those kind of authentic, realize that like people at different stages of their career have different bandwidths. A lot of times I will get a lot of sort of just email solicitations for help, and I have to be careful because I want to answer them all, but I also have to think about, how do I maintain my journal work, and how do I maintain my own research, and how do I balance some of those? And also too, sometimes, we mean to answer something, and then we look in our email and we're like, whoops, that was 3 months ago and I forgot to answer that. So, recognize sometimes if you don't hear from somebody, it's not that they are dissing you. They might just honestly might have, zero bandwidth, or that email got lost in the morass. So I think showing genuine admiration for others, interest to build, moving strategically, interest to do the work, again, to build real relationships versus trying to connect with bigger names, I think is always going to help pay off, and leverage your networks. A good friend of mine said it's good to have a mentor, a ventor, and a sponsor. Someone who can mentor you, someone that you can vent to, not on social media, because especially as a journal editor, we get a lot of abuse. And it's really interesting sometimes when you see people tweeting or posting things that you're like, I can see you, I know who that is. And I'm the editor you're talking about. And that's not cool. And then somebody who will put you forward for things, who will, if you email them and say, hey, I just read this, I would love to meet this person. And if they know them, they can connect you in those ways. So thinking about, how to have a person that you can trust to vent your frustrations, somebody who can teach you some of the rules, and then someone who can put you forward for opportunities.
Okay, so one of the questions we have is, in what stage of your academic journey should you have a personal research brand?
I would say, identity and brand are two different things. They can become synonymous, but I think if you have a thoughtful identity from early on that you begin to cultivate, you begin to water, that you treat like an intellectual garden, that eventually will become your brand in some ways. And the degree to which that becomes a huge brand. So somebody I went to grad school with is sort of like a Twitter giant, like in a public intellectual. And it's really interesting watching that happen. And I'm like, I have no interest in that. Like, I don't want that kind of level of personal brand. But I think, a clear identity and refreshing that over time will become a brand. So I think it starts early on. Doesn't mean, but not in a way that's going to stress you out. Because I think social media can be rough. And I'm sort of thankful social media did not exist at the beginning of my career, because you're seeing like, I just got this publication or I just got this grant. You're like, oh God, how do I keep up with it? You do have to think about, what am I doing that's going to make me successful? And then how do I choose to wade into these things? Or how do I choose for my own mental health and well-being what to filter out? Because not everyone too that's posting about how fabulous they are is actually doing that fabulous. So.
Yeah, I like that distinction between identity and brand, because I guess going back to what I said at the start, having moved through different disciplines and fields, there's a sense in which my brand changed at various points. And, perhaps the brand is both the story that you tell about your identity and also the story other people tell about you. So the more you can integrate those different aspects, the more comfortable it will feel. But I realize, I often use the analogy of hats. I feel like I wear different hats in different settings. Some of the hats I'm known for, others I'm not, or was known for. Like the sociology of asexuality was a huge part of my work for a long time. And I find it interesting when people I've only known in education find that out, and they often struggle to reconcile, talking about LMSs and generative AI with the fact I was a qualitative sexualities researcher for a long time. And so sometimes your brands can't fit together and they're discordant and people find them confusing. And so you have to be strategic. But if the brand is something you can make your comfort with because it does reflect a story that you're telling about what matters to you, then that can be okay. And I feel I've made my peace with the fact that I wear different hats in different settings, and sometimes people are neither interested in nor might not actually be supportive of hats I wear in other settings. But again, social media can be helpful for this because it's a forum where you encounter this as a problem, but it's also a forum where you can practice being reflexive in response to that problem. And I think that practice is important, to try and have conversations where you narrate why you do, what moves you. And the more you can do that, the more comfortable it becomes. And I think that can really help knit together what might otherwise be a fragmented sense of professional identity.
One of the ways that I've been really intrigued and impressed by people when I attend conferences, whether it's online or face-to-face, and there are students who are at the very beginning of their journey as scholars, but they're already out there talking about it. You know, they're talking about the questions they're asking. And, you know, so they're beginning to spark the interest of others, of more experienced researchers who may have the kind of attitude that Jessica was describing, of kind of looking out for, you know, those people who are starting out in the areas that interest you, and, you know, might make you want to, well, gee, did you, you know, here's something that might interest you. Here's an article that you might, you know, I know someone working in that field. So these, you know, kind of beginning people, and I don't want to say young, because we may enter this world at various life stages. So I guess my response to that question about what stages, get started, you know, talk about what interests you now, even if you're like, well, you know, I haven't accomplished very much. Well, that's okay. What are the questions you're asking? You know, what are you trying to connect? We've talked a lot about disciplines and kind of multidisciplinary fields that are emerging, where, you know, in some ways it makes our identity feel like it's across, you know, we don't fit in one specific box, but there may be other people who are looking at those connections too. So I say, you know, have the courage to, you know, speak, you know, about your work, wherever you're at, and, you know, take it from there, which leads to another question was, how do I develop an interdisciplinary research agenda? So for both of you who are in kind of cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary fields, how have you approached that?
I think one of the things is sort of recognizing, there's a famous strategy scholar, Michael Porter, who says sometimes being strategic is knowing what not to do. So you got to think about how to make sure that you don't divide yourself so much that you almost become sort of a bunch of different areas that don't coalesce into that one sort of, you know, I think you want to think about what is your core identity, and then how you maybe have several different groups of people that are your people, or, you know, so like I have my nonprofit people, I have my human resource management scholars, I have my public management scholars, and now I'm actually doing a little bit more work sort of cultivating, going to more international conferences and cultivating a sort of global relationships there. And so I think some of that is thinking about how much can I slice the onion before the onion loses all its flavor. Sorry, I always have chefy references and things, but so thinking about that, how do I make sure? So I know when I write review letters for people's tenure or promotion cases, what I always do is I start with their CV and their research, and I read it and I think, who do I think they are as a scholar? And then I read their statement afterwards. And if it aligns, that's really cool. That means they've sort of made choices and thought about and put forward a clear identity. The other thing that I think is really important is just to always remember that, like, we're trying to learn. And when I see people's research agenda, especially if it's even across different disciplines, that there's this sense that each thing they do is building themselves and they're learning and growing from that. That is the coolest thing to see. And that gets me excited when I see someone's work and I see that they're really reflecting and growing, because every time we finish a piece, we probably would have done a completely different piece, but we wouldn't have known that if we hadn't written the piece. So sort of that humility and growth and willingness to be like, I'm on this journey and I hope you join me. I think that that's how you can sort of think about, you know, and I read this thing over here and it's really cool, so I'm going to help translate that for this audience, versus just bringing it in and being like, well, if you don't get how it connects, then you're clearly, you know, missing something, versus, okay, it's maybe my job to think about how to cross all these streams together so that you understand my vision for where I'm going.
And to do that, you have to understand how people are going to perceive you. I mean, this is something that I found very challenging as someone who, you know, for a long time was not seeking a permanent academic job or a full-time academic job. And when that changed for various biographical reasons, I was suddenly confronted with the problem that my CV looked really, really weird. People didn't understand it. And it was clear I was in a relatively strong position compared to the one I could have been in, because it was clear I published a lot and I was well networked. And so those worked in my favor. But I had various interview questions where, people asked to varying degrees of explicitness, so what's that publications list? Because it jumped around from sexuality studies to, really arcane social ontology, to social movements, to social media. And it was very difficult for me to construct a narrative. And the one I eventually hit on was simply, this is what I've done in the past. There are a few core questions underpinning this that interest me. This is what I want to specialize in now. And what I want to specialize in now is the job I'm applying for. And I think as funding gets tied to particular specialisms, there's a horrible tension I think a lot of early career researchers increasingly face between a demand for specialization, but competing specialisms mean that you also have to be able to pivot and shift at the same time. And that's a very difficult thing to negotiate. And now that I'm in my third year of a secure permanent job, which I do enjoy to the extent that I wish I'd pursued it earlier. Narrating is still difficult sometimes. So I have these different communities, and increasingly I do see them as different communities. I have the digital education people I speak to, I have the theory people I speak to, and I have the practice people I speak to. But having a common sense of professional identity across those groups is quite tricky. I've fallen into just keeping the label digital sociologist, largely because I think even if people don't entirely understand what it means, they can locate me in some way that feels comfortable. Sociologist, interested in digital stuff. It's broad and it gives a sense of where I'm coming from, because that's, I think, ultimately what identity is. Whereas in my mind, I'm a social theorist who is also interested in practice. And I have a clear sense of myself, which is not the one I use professionally, simply because I've tried articulating my actual sense of professional self, and it just doesn't work. You need to find an identity that people respond to that allows them to position you, hopefully not in a reductive way. And again, I think it's experimentation. You get a sense of what works. And when you feel something working, try and understand why it works. Who does it work for and why? And then refine it on that basis. I think in essence, we just have to be very reflexive if we're moving between disciplines. And that's the kind of meta skill that isn't really adequately taught. It's something that we have to learn and we have to practice and develop ourselves.
We have one question that I think may resonate with a number of our attendees and viewers about how, working in a low resource academic institution, can you develop a sustainable research agenda even within funding and other constraints?
That's a challenging question. And I realize I speak from a position of relative privilege as a tenured full professor at a Research One university in the United States. That being said, I've collected a lot of my own data throughout my career and done a lot of collaborative work without a huge amount of grant funding. And so some of that is maybe thinking about, what do you bring to collaborations? What are maybe particular areas where, you might not have the financial resources to bring, but you're excellent at particular areas of research and you can bring that to a research team. So I always joke, I'm sort of the human literature review. I have a kind of photographic memory, and it's sort of one of my things. My friends always call me and like, Jess, what should I read for this? So I always joke I should hire myself out as like, the second author on every article. But I'm joking, like think about, is there a particular thing that you're really good at that maybe, you can find partners that might have more financial resources to do that? And building those relationships, reaching out to people. We've been talking at several conferences, and this is where actually it is on some of the more senior people in our fields, broadly speaking, to try to build these. We're hoping to do a Projects Without Partners event at one of our conferences, because sometimes certain points of our career, we have all this data, we don't have the time to write it up. So trying to look at the conferences, see if there are those like speed datings or sections are a great way to start building your network, especially if you're shy. If there's like a section on X that is your particular wheelhouse in a larger conference, go to that. And that's a lot less scary than like a big room of, 5,000 scholars, and just start to have those, conversations. I find people are, or at least in my field, we're very blessed. We have a lot of really, really friendly people who reach out to a lot of people, but look for those opportunities for early career scholars in sort of smaller environments. Be willing to maybe volunteer for things. And that's a great way to kind of start building your brand.
Mm-hmm.
One big area for me in one of my big professional associations, I got involved in one of the sections, ended up chairing it. And then by the time I was going out for tenure, I was elected to the board of directors of that association. And I ended up organizing the conference for 3 years, which definitely helped increase my visibility in that community. But I had paid my dues through like small volunteering opportunities over time.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned professional societies, because I think that is a channel that, even if you're working in an institution that doesn't have as many resources, look for the opportunities to join professional societies. If you are a student, there's usually a very low price for joining as a student. And then, so if you are a student watching this, you could look at, maybe there are 2 or 3 you want to explore to find like, where do you feel most comfortable? Where can you get involved? But sometimes you can find, resources, whether it's through partnerships or through other kinds of benefits through a society that might have, cover a broader geographic area, et cetera. I know that, working for SAGE as I do, that Method Space, which is the academic blog that I run, is open access. And we invite contributions, as well as offering opportunities, to read and find resources. So, looking for some of those, if you're not in an institution that has all of the subscriptions to all the databases, sometimes you can get access to those through a professional society. So, look for some of those kinds of opportunities. What other suggestions do you have, Mark?
Yeah, well, one of the few positives of the adaptations we made during the acute phase of COVID was the shift to webinars and the normalization of webinars. And, they've diminished, but they are still remaining. And I do think that's really positive. There's been a lack of innovation in how we do webinars, playing around with formats, playing around with how to tie them into things like blogs. But it's really positive because they are the single best way of facilitating internationalization that I think exists. And we need to think about how to do webinars in a way that supports internationalization more and facilitates connections. But for low resource contexts, I think finding those opportunities to take part in distributed academic meetings, particularly opportunities to follow up on them in some ways. Are there blogging projects? Are there special issues? Are there edited books that come out of them? And to consider running your own as well. And it can be a lot of work. It is a lot of work to get, for example, a YouTube channel or a podcast working effectively and win an audience through it. But I know some great examples where scholars in low resource contexts have done this very effectively. A YouTube channel called Doing Sociology is probably my favorite example of this. But, I think there are quite a few of them. And so there are lots of problems with contemporary social media. I was doing a talk earlier on today purely about those problems. But this is the side of it that I think is really important. The capacity for a more global, inclusive academy. Webinars, blogging, podcasting, YouTube certainly cannot erase international inequalities. But it is just always going to be fundamentally more accessible to participate remotely in this way than it is to fly across the world, negotiate visa issues, book accommodation in a possibly expensive city. And I think international learned societies and membership associations particularly need to do more to facilitate this kind of academic digital sphere, because it did reach its peak during COVID and it is in decline. And I worry that economic pressures that drive societies towards face-to-face conferences mean they just don't want to do this because you can't really make money off it, at least not in the way that a large international conference is potentially profitable.
Well, before we wrap up, I would like to share with the people who are in the low resource countries and institutions, another organization I partner with called Author Aid. And you can just Google that, and we will put it in our follow-up information, because one of the things that Author Aid does is offer opportunities both to mentor others and to find a mentor. So if you're someone who is struggling with some of the kinds of questions that were posed here, and you're looking for someone who can help you, maybe English is not your first language, you haven't published in Western publications, and you're trying to navigate that, they have mini courses and lots of resources that's specifically aimed at assisting in that way. So I know that there are more questions and we've had a chance to answer. We will be sending a follow-up email, and we'll also have some additional posts on methodspace.com where I'll take some of these questions and try to provide some additional resources. So check back there. So Sean, what else would you like to say to wrap up for today?
Hi, everybody. Just sharing that January 31st, we have the next iteration of the How to Do Research and Get Published webinar series. So this webinar series is ending for the year, but it'll be restarting again in January. So please do be on the lookout for that. The topic here will be how to connect your studies methodology with publication options. So definitely something to check out if you're interested. In addition, just a list of what else is upcoming. In February, we have a webinar about conducting a reference search. And in March, we'll have a session about qualitative methodology. So please do be on the lookout for that. And as Janet flagged, I will be sending links to those directly in webinar follow-up. You can also check out some of our journal resources. We have a dedicated space for all of this. We have how to get published resources, guides to the previous recordings and future registrations. And also for anybody who speaks and reads Chinese, we have a Chinese author gateway for more information there. So a big thank you to Janet for moderating today, and for Jessica and Mark for your participation as panelists. And thank you so much to everybody for joining. We hope to see you in a future webinar in the new year. So take care.